Hello again, and welcome to the fourth and last presentation of the introduction to the Swedish welfare system. And this presentation is about the gender equality in Sweden. Steps towards gender equality. Well, the earliest steps taken in this direction, I would say, comes from a king in the 1200s, Birger Jarl. Very wise king. He founded the what was to become the most beautiful capital in the world, that is Stockholm. He also introduced four what he called peace laws. So it should be peace at home, peace in the churches, and peace in the court of law. And the fourth one was peace for women. That was to protect women from abuse, from violence and sexual abuse. I mentioned the Constitution from 1634 previously, and in it is something that originally was not seen as a sort of gender thing, more like a class thing, and that is that when applying for a governmental job, there are only two things that should be relevant: your skills and your merits. Your background should not matter at all. And also in the new Constitution from 1974, we have it again. During the 18th century, there were a lot of laws on gender equality taken, often step by step. Like, for example, women were allowed to start their own businesses if they were widows, not if they were married. Unmarried women were given the status of legal persons, not being minors, from the age of 25 and then lowered to 21. Academia opened also for women gradually. From the beginning, they were not allowed to study law, and they were not allowed to study some other subjects, like, for example, theology. That's why we had the first women priests graduating first in 1958 in our countries. I mentioned the thing with the conditional suffrage for men if they had carried out their military service, meaning that universal suffrage was introduced for women before men. However, the women really had to fight for their rights. And in the picture behind me, you can see one of the active women handing over 351,000 signatures from citizens in Sweden to the parliament in 1914, demanding suffrage for women. Also, during the 20th century, of course, there were plenty of reforms and introduced, like, for example, 1931, we got a basic pension which was equal for men and for women. In 1960, the trade unions and employer organizations agreed to, within a 5-year period, phase out the different women's salaries. Before that, there were a lower salary for a woman and a higher for a man, even if they performed the same job. That was abolished in the mid-1960s. We had also an individualization of taxation in 1971. As I mentioned, we pay high taxes and we have a progressive tax rate in our country. And that means if the family or household are taxed together, then the profit is very low because you have such a high tax rate on the top income. So by having individualized taxations, it encouraged women to enter the labor market. And this was really the case from the 1970s, more women entering the labor market. Also with the expansion of the kindergartens and the possibilities to take paternal leave or parental insurance. From the beginning it was only women, but then with the introduction of more days and also some days especially for men, or it's not especially one man, only men, it's for one gender, but i.e. men. And today we have 390 days with up to 80% of the salary you can receive in this parental insurance, plus 90 days with a much lower benefit. We had a new law against gender discrimination in 1980, and also the introduction of an equality ombudsman. Of course, there were laws against discrimination also before that. In 1939, for example, employers were no longer allowed to sack women if they became pregnant or after giving birth or for this kind of reasons. We got a new law on discrimination in 2009 where we sort of gathered gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, etc. And I mentioned before, work more and work smarter is the two ways of increasing the wealth in your nation. And in order to afford a welfare state, everybody that can needs to participate. And as you can see on this picture, the red line is Sweden. So you see we have a very high general employment rate, second in Europe only to Iceland. The dark green line is the EU average, and this is from 2018. And when it comes to women, you can see that women have also a very high participation rate, also after Iceland. And again, the dark green line is the EU average. And this is if you look into the employment gap by gender, then you can see that there is enormous gap between men and women in Turkey, and then also in other southern European countries. And then in the northern European countries, the difference is much smaller. And I would say there are two main reasons today why the rate is still lower for women. One is that they take greater responsibilities for the children when the children are at a tender age, and also the fact that women go to universities a much higher degree than men. There's like 2/3 of every graduate in Sweden almost is a woman today. I will mention this more in a minute. Here are the figures from the Nordic countries, and then you can see then again Iceland almost 90% in the general employment rate and 83.3% for women. In the case of Sweden, it's 82.5 in general and 78.3 for women. So these lines show people born in Sweden and people born abroad. And then you can see from top to bottom, men born in Sweden, women born in Sweden, men born abroad, and women born abroad. So you can see that there is a catching up to do for us. If we want to afford the system we have, we need to increase the employment rate about the foreign-born population. If we then look into the wage gap between men and women in our country, from 2018, you can see that women have a salary or a wage which is 89.3% of what a man has. And that is if you look to the raw statistics, you find this 10.7% difference. But if you sort of do what is called a standard weighing, if you look into which sectors men and women are working, and also take into consideration, and I think the most important thing, more women work part-time, then this gap shrinks to 4.4%. And it's also a fact that men commute much more and longer distances. And commuting is more common if you have a permanent job and if you have a high income job where you find most men. But if you take that into consideration, you will find that the gap is only 3.5%. And if you look in the development since the 2005, you can see it's going down all the time. And I would say in a few years there will be practically no difference at all. And that is due to the fact that I mentioned mainly. Women graduate from university at a much higher rate than men. Also in educations that were previously dominated by men. Like, for example, 57% of all graduates from the doctor universities are now women, and that gives them high salaries. Also, when it comes to law, which used to be very equal, it's now 62% women graduating, and that is also sort of springboard to higher salaries. Also, the fact that the difference between employed in public sector and private sector is gradually diminishing. So in 10 years' time, you will see a totally different line. This picture shows that our country or our labor market is very gender divided. On the left-hand side, you see the dark blue are 1,066,000 women and 72,000 men on the right side with the light blue. And that shows the 30 most common professions in the country. And not to go through all of them, but there is a vast majority of women in care, everything from kindergarten to nurses, assistant nurses, specialist nurses, elderly care, taking care of people in the home with special needs, also in education, especially in compulsory school. Whereas men still dominate a lot when it comes to truck drivers, carpenters, electronics, machine operators, and this kind of traditional male professions. And I think that also explains this picture. This shows the number of women or the rate of women as entrepreneurs. And there you can see again in the red line, we are at the bottom or close to bottom with only, say, 28% of all entrepreneurs are women, which is much lower than the EU average, which is around 35%, and Latvia in top with 45%. And I think the fact is that we have this gender divided labor market. I said in the previous presentation that we have liberalized the welfare sector, meaning it's easier for private providers to enter, but it's still more difficult than in others. And I think that due to the fact that we have this gender divided labor market, we also have fewer women as entrepreneurs. And it's hotly debated in Sweden if it should be more liberalization in the welfare sector, if it should be kept like it is. So, thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you soon in Sweden, in South Africa, or anywhere else for that matter. Thank you.